The most dangerous man east of the Rockies had been undone by a figure he couldn't find in his own ledgers. Everyone assumed the threat to Raymond Saxton would come with a gun attached. It came with a decimal point. 6 months of looking. 6 months of paying the best forensic accountants in the country to sit across from him in boardrooms and tell him, with great confidence and greater invoices, that they couldn't locate the source of the discrepancy either. The money was gone. 3.4 million, siphoned in careful increments over 18 months by someone who understood exactly how Saxton thought. Someone close enough to know where to hide. The dining room of the Saxton property in West Vancouver had become a war room. The long table that once held dinner parties now held stacked files. The chandelier threw sharp light on columns of numbers that refused to tell him the truth. He hadn't slept properly in 4 months, not since the discovery. Before that, he'd been efficient about rest. 6 hours, no more, no less. Now he lay in the dark and ran figures in his head and arrived, every time, at the same gap he couldn't explain. His physician had tried sleeping medication. Saxton flushed it. He didn't put things in his body that other people had prepared. Not anymore. Downstairs, in the record sub-level, a climate-controlled basement that housed 18 years of the Saxton Group's legitimate paper trail, Lark Denny was trying to find a pen that worked. She checked 3 before finding one with ink. The small wire shelf above the filing desk held a box of promotional pens from a conference she hadn't attended, apparently collected by whichever temp had worked this desk before her. She had been here 6 weeks. She expected to be here 6 more, or until the contract ended, whichever came first. The records department closed at 6. Lark worked the late shift, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., because the rate was 30% higher and because she was constitutionally incapable of sleeping before 3 anyway. The debt her father had left behind when he disappeared didn't care about her sleep schedule. The amount owing to a private creditor named Beaumont did not adjust itself to accommodate Lark's preferences. She pulled a fresh file box from the shelf. Q3 2 years back. Her job was to digitize the physical records, cross-reference them against the archived digital entries, and flag discrepancies for the accounting department. It was tedious enough to be meditative. Numbers didn't change. They didn't lie, not on their own. If a number was wrong, something had been done to it. That was the only comfort of figures. They were passive. They just sat there being wrong until someone looked. Lark had been looking at numbers her whole life. She opened the box and began working through the invoices in order. Vendor payments, service contracts, utilities for 3 different commercial properties. All routine, she logged them against the digital record, noted 2 minor entry errors, moved on. At 11:43, she found the first one. It wasn't dramatic. It never was. A single vendor payment. A maintenance company called Arkleen Services logged against a Granville Street property for $8,000. The physical invoice in the box said $6,400. Someone had added $1,600 to the transfer and not adjusted the source document. Lark circled it in red pen, made a note, dropped the file in her to clarify tray. She moved to the next box. By 2 in the morning, she had found 11 more. Different vendors, different properties, different amounts, but the same underlying logic. The digital record always ran slightly higher than the physical invoice. The gap was never consistent, never round enough to be an obvious data entry mistake. It was the work of someone who understood that auditors look for patterns. They had been careful to vary the amounts. They hadn't been careful enough about the structure. Lark stacked the flagged files neatly, clipped a page of her own handwritten summary calculations to the top, and set the pile beside the tray. She would mention it to the department supervisor in the morning. For now, she still had 4 boxes to process. She didn't hear the elevator. She heard the footsteps. The records level had a specific silence, insulated, slightly pressurized, the hum of climate control a constant background frequency. The footsteps cut through it with a clarity that made her straighten. Heavy, deliberate, one set. The door opened. Lark turned around. Raymond Saxton stood in the doorway. She had seen him once from across the lobby, moving through the building the way powerful men moved through spaces, as though the space adjusted itself around him, not the other way around. Up close, the reality was different from what she'd expected. He was tall, yes, and the suit was expensive, and the jaw was the kind that photographed well. But he looked terrible. The shadows under his eyes were deep enough to seem structural, as if they'd been carved there over months of insufficient sleep. There was a sharpness to his face that had gone past, lean into something that looked like erosion. He was looking at the files on her desk. Specifically, the stack she had flagged. He walked in without speaking. Lark didn't stand. She wasn't sure she was supposed to, and she'd learned that performing deference you didn't feel was more offensive than simply being still. Saxton picked up the stack. He read the top sheet, her handwritten summary, without expression. He turned to the second page, then the third. A muscle in his jaw moved. "You found these tonight," he said. His voice was low, controlled, not a question. "Yes." "In how long?" 3 hours, roughly. I still have 4 boxes to go." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the stack and set it down with more care than she expected from someone radiating that particular kind of coiled tension. "These are from Q3, 2 years back," he said. "Yes, Q4 and the previous year are still in the boxes. If the pattern holds, the figures will be in there as well." Saxton turned and looked at the shelves. Then at her, "Start from 3 years back, work forward." Lark blinked. "I have a process. I'm supposed to work in sequence." "I'm changing your sequence." He said it the way someone changes the channel. Not cruelly, just with complete certainty that the remote was theirs. He pulled over the spare chair from the corner, sat at the end of the desk, and said nothing else. Lark looked at him. She looked at the shelves. She looked back at him. "I want my own login to the archive system," she said. "The shared access gets logged against the department account, and I can't trace what I've touched separately. If this goes anywhere, I need a clear record of what I flagged and when." Saxton studied her for a moment. "Done." "Tonight." "Tonight," he said, and pulled out his phone. By the time she had retrieved the earliest available boxes, a text had arrived on the department terminal. Her own credentials. She logged in, confirmed the access, and began. He didn't talk. He didn't help. He sat at the end of the desk and watched her work with the same flat intensity she imagined he brought to everything, the kind of attention that had nothing comfortable in it. Lark ignored it. She'd been watched by unimpressed supervisors and skeptical landlords, and one memorable collections agent who'd sat across from her in a folding chair while she presented transfer receipts. Being observed didn't unsettle her. Numbers that were wrong unsettled her. At 3:45 she set her pen down. 38 instances. 3 fiscal years. I've compiled the totals. She slid the summary across the desk. Saxton picked it up. She watched his face while he read. Nothing moved except that muscle in his jaw again. "Arclean Services doesn't exist," Lark said. "I searched the registry while I was waiting for a box to finish scanning. No business registration, no address, no incorporation papers." Saxton set the sheet down and said very quietly, "No. It was created for this. Someone built a shell and routed the overages through it. The maintenance invoices are real. Those vendors exist. But whoever was entering the transfers inflated the amounts and redirected the surplus. You'd need to trace the receiving account to confirm the destination." She said it the same way she'd said everything else. Flat, factual, the way she'd explain a reconciliation error to a client. Not because she was performing calm. The numbers themselves were calm. They had been quietly wrong for 3 years. They would keep being wrong until they weren't. Saxton stood up. He moved toward the door, then stopped. His back was to her. "What's your name?" "Lark Denny." A pause. "How long have you been on this contract?" 6 weeks. He was quiet for a moment she couldn't read. "I want you here tomorrow night. Same time. Malone will send you the details." The door swung shut. Lark sat in the particular silence of the records level. Then she looked at the remaining boxes and went back to work. Over the next 3 weeks, a rhythm established itself. The rhythm was quiet. It was built on red ink and reference numbers and the low hum of the climate control unit. Lark worked from 10 at night until 4 in the morning, sometimes 5. She built a cross-referenced map of every financial irregularity she could find. Where the money had gone, how the shell had been structured, which individual would have needed access to the specific combination of systems required to execute each transfer across 3 years without triggering an internal flag. Saxton came down most nights around midnight. He didn't announce himself. He appeared, sat at the far end of the desk, and watched her build the map. Some nights he brought coffee, 2 cups, one of which he placed at her elbow without comment. She drank it. She didn't thank him. It seemed to be the correct response, and he didn't appear to expect otherwise. He asked questions, good ones, the kind that came from someone who thought in flows and gaps and timing, who understood that money moved the same way water did. It went where the pressure was lowest, and it left traces if you knew the right surfaces to check. She answered him without softening anything. He received the answers without flinching. It wasn't warmth exactly. It was a kind of precision, 2 people who both thought in the same language, building the same map in a room that smelled of old paper and recycled air while the city above them was quiet. On the 9th night, she found the name. She sat with it for a few minutes, checking her work twice. Then she looked up. It's Deverell, she said. Saxton's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, like a load-bearing wall absorbing an impact it hadn't been designed for. His operations manager, 12 years. Show me. She showed him, walk by walk, entry by entry, the access logs, the transfer patterns, the false vendor account, all of it linking to one employee ID, used exclusively during one rotating shift pattern, in one specific window when the oversight systems were running their scheduled maintenance cycle. Saxton looked at the final page for a long time. He has been in my home, he said. Not to her, to the room, to the file, to the specific wait of 12 years. He sat at my table, he knew my schedule. He knew my systems because I trusted him with my systems. He pressed one hand flat against the desk. The gesture was controlled. The knuckles were white. Lark watched him and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. The numbers had already said it. After a moment, he straightened. His voice came back to its usual register. How long until you have something complete? 2 nights, maybe 3. He looked at the map she'd built, 3 weeks laid out in colored tabs and careful columns. You did this in 3 weeks. I had 4 professionals on it for 5 months. They were looking for money, Lark said. I was looking for where the numbers stopped making sense. It's a different question. He looked at her. Not the flat assessment he usually brought through the door, something more complicated and less guarded. He left without another word. On the 12th night, she had everything. She also had a problem. Lark had arrived early and found the records level door already unlocked. She assumed maintenance. She walked in, began setting up her materials, and noticed the man standing beside the shelving unit at the back of the room. He was not maintenance. He was young, well-dressed, and he was holding the stack of flagged files, her 3 weeks of work, with the careful grip of someone who had come prepared to take them and leave nothing behind. Lark did not run, running in a basement with one exit to someone standing between her, and that exit was not a viable calculation. She stood still and moved quickly inside her head. Those are the Q3 reconciliation files, she said. Her voice came out flat. They're supposed to be in the secure cabinet. Did someone leave them out? The man looked at her. He was doing the same assessment she was. Who are you? He said. Data entry contractor, Lark Denny. She held up her lanyard. Contract numbers on the back. Who are you? A beat. I work for Mr. Deverell. Right. She walked to her desk with the purposefulness of someone who is absolutely supposed to be here and is mildly inconvenienced by the interruption. She sat down and opened her laptop. Those files need to go back in the secure cabinet when you're done. If you leave them on the desk, I'll refile them. She had already triggered the internal alert, 2 keys held simultaneously, set up by Malone on her first night. She held them now, hands on the keyboard, expression neutral. The man looked at the files. He looked at her. He was deciding something. The door opened. Malone filled the doorway in the particular way large men with operational experience filled doorways, completely and without announcement. The man with her files made the only smart decision he'd made all evening. He set them on the desk, raised both hands, and said nothing. Lark exhaled. She hadn't noticed she'd stopped breathing. They took him upstairs. Lark stayed in the records level and finished her work. She was aware this was possibly irrational, completing a data reconciliation while an interrogation presumably occurred somewhere above her. But the work needed finishing, and sitting idle would only make her hands shake. Saxton came down an hour later. He looked at the completed summary on the desk, then at her. You triggered the alert. Yes. You didn't try to leave. There was someone between me and the door, Lark said, and leaving would have meant abandoning 3 weeks of work. Something moved in his expression that she hadn't seen before. He sat in his usual chair and looked at the summary without picking it up. Deverell knows I have his name now. He sent that man to retrieve the physical documentation. He didn't finish the sentence. He'll try something else, Lark said. Yes. She looked at her completed files, at the careful map of 3 years of betrayal, every wrong number found and marked and proven. I should be clear about something. Saxton waited. I found the discrepancy, she said, and every correction I've documented, every line I've fixed, it feeds into whatever you do about it. She met his eyes. I should understand that clearly. He held her gaze. He didn't dress it up. Yes, you should. I correct the books, Lark said, and I have to live knowing what happens when the books are right. He was quiet. Outside the records level, somewhere far above them, the building made the particular sounds that buildings made when things were being handled. Lark sat with what she understood that to mean, and did not pretend she didn't understand it. You could have stopped after the first night, Saxton said finally, taken the contract rate, and handed me a partial report. The numbers weren't finished. No, they weren't. He looked at her for a long moment. The erosion in his face was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. The held breath quality that had been present every time he walked through the door was gone. There are other files. Deverell had access to systems I haven't fully audited. 2 more years, minimum. Lark thought of Beaumont's timeline. She thought of the precise satisfaction of finding a wrong number and proving it wrong. She thought of the man who'd stood in the back of this room an hour ago, and what might have happened. I want a raise, she said. The corner of Saxton's mouth moved, not quite a smile, a fractional adjustment in a face that didn't have many of those. How much? She told him. He didn't flinch. Done, he said, and Malone drives you here and home each night until this is fully resolved. I don't need. Someone was in this room tonight who knew your name. He said it quietly. No performance of authority. Just a fact, stated the way she stated figures. What Deverell set in motion doesn't stop because he's been removed. You're in the ledger now, Lark. The first time he'd used her name, it landed with more weight than she expected. You don't get to pretend you're not. She looked at the map she had built. Weeks of work, every wrong number caught and corrected. She thought about what she'd said. I correct the books, and I have to live knowing what happens when the books are right, and realized she had already decided she could live with it. She'd made that decision without marking it, somewhere around the 3rd night, when the pattern had become clear, and she'd kept going anyway. The files don't leave this room, she said. If you need to show anything to anyone, they come here. Agreed. And I work my own hours, no schedule from anyone else. Agreed. She looked at the shelf behind him. There's a discrepancy in the Q1 utility accounts for the Burnaby property. I noticed it earlier, before your man interrupted me. Probably unrelated to Deverell. A pause. Probably. Saxton looked at the shelf, then at her. Something settled in his face, the same thing she'd seen when she found Deverell's name, that quality of relief that tries very hard not to look like relief. "Show me," he said. She pulled the box. She set it between them on the desk and found the invoice in question, smoothed the folded corner flat. Saxton leaned in to look. For the next hour they worked. Not employer and contractor. Not powerful and powerless. Two people who thought in the same language, in a room that smelled of old paper and recycled air, while the city moved through the specific quiet of 3 a.m. At some point, without either of them marking it, he stopped sitting like a man braced for the next blow. His shoulders dropped a fraction. He picked up her red pen and circled something without asking. She corrected his notation without apology. He read the correction and made a sound that was almost acknowledgement. When the invoice was resolved and the note drafted for morning, Lark set her pen down. She looked at the clock, 4:14. "I need to catch the bus," she said. "Malone will drive you," I said. "It's 4 in the morning, and someone with a specific interest in stopping your work knows your name and your contract number." He still wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the completed file, at the red circles and the neat columns, at 3 weeks of work that had done what 5 months of expensive professionals hadn't. Let Malone drive you. She stood and gathered her things. At the door she paused without fully turning. The Burnaby discrepancy is minor, probably a data entry error from the original processing. She shouldered her bag. "But I'll check the neighboring quarters next session. If it's part of a pattern, it won't be standing alone." "Lark." She turned. Saxton was still at the desk. He was looking at the map, at weeks of her work, every wrong number found and marked and corrected and proven, laid out with red ink and paper clips and the particular neatness of someone who has always had to be precise, because she never had the luxury of approximation. In the flat fluorescent light, with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled, and the 4 months of insomnia sitting openly on his face for the first time, he looked like someone who had been standing underwater for a very long time and had just, cautiously, found the surface. 3 years of falsified records, he said, corrected and documented in 3 weeks. He paused. No one else found a single figure. "They were looking for the money," Lark said again. "I was looking for where the numbers stopped making sense. It's a different question." A silence that was longer than it needed to be if it were only about figures. "I don't know yet what the full debt looks like," Saxton said carefully. "What I owe you, beyond the contract." "Run the numbers," she said. "That's what we do." Something settled in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile, and more honest. She turned and walked out. Malone was in the corridor. She let him drive her home. She looked out the window at the dark city moving past, the streetlights and the wet pavement and the particular stillness of Vancouver in the hour before dawn, when the night shift ends and the morning shift hasn't started, and the city belongs briefly to no one. In her bag was her notebook with 3 weeks of calculations. Behind her, in a basement room with the wrong numbers finally made right, was a man who had not slept properly in 4 months and who had spent the last hour, without seeming to notice, forgetting to be afraid. She pulled out her notebook. She thought about the Burnaby files. She thought about which quarter to check first, and how the pattern would likely show itself once she knew where to look, and how numbers were patient things. They simply waited, being wrong, certain that someone would eventually come along who cared enough to find them. She started planning for tomorrow night.